The envelope was already in my hand when Reed walked through the door. Not a greeting card, not a bill. A confirmation statement from my brokerage. 2 pages, folded once, carrying the particular weight of 14 months of very deliberate decisions. I had read it 3 times that morning at the white oak table Walter built the spring of 2004, the one with the slight bow in the middle that he never got around to fixing, and I had set it face down next to my coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold. I hadn't noticed until just then, when Reed came in without knocking, and I heard the click of the front door latch behind him. He had his wife's canvas tote over one shoulder. That was the first sign. Reed doesn't carry tote bags. Reed carries a briefcase that cost $1,100 and announces itself before he does. The tote meant he'd packed something. Documents, probably. Printouts. Claire came in right after him. She still has Walter's forehead, wide and calm. And she was wearing it the way she wears everything she's worried about, which is to say she had arranged it into an expression of patient concern. So practiced, it almost looked real. Almost. I've known that forehead since the morning she was born. I know what it does when it's genuinely calm, and I know what it does when she is managing herself very hard in order to manage me. Behind her, a man I did not know, mid-40s, blue suit, no tie, the kind of soft leather portfolio that says fee-only advisor to anyone who's ever sat across a conference table from one. I did not put down the envelope. "Mom," Reed said, "we need to talk." Those 4 words. Every woman in this room knows those 4 words. They are never actually about talking. I want to tell you what happened next. I want to tell you how it ended, because that's why you're here. And you deserve to know going in that it ends the way quiet things end when they have been built with patience and precision and a level of forward planning that none of the people in my living room had thought to extend to me. It ends with papers on a table, not theirs, mine. But to understand what those papers meant, you have to understand what the 44 months before that Tuesday looked like from where I was standing. Because the intervention, and they did call it that, eventually Reed actually used the word, which I will get to, was not the beginning of anything. It was the moment a plan that had been running underground for nearly 4 years broke the surface, the way a root breaks concrete, quietly, completely, without asking permission. So, let me go back to where this actually started. Walter Mallory died on a Thursday in February, 17 months after the company that had employed him for 31 years escorted him to the parking garage with a cardboard box, a handshake from an HR coordinator, young enough to be his granddaughter, and a severance package that worked out to approximately 11 days of pay per year of service. He was 68. He had a corner office the size of a studio apartment. He had a wall full of framed commendations and a division he had built from 11 people to 240. He had a firm handshake and a way of laughing at himself that made other people feel large. Viridian Consolidated Group fired him on a Tuesday. By Friday, they had sent a facilities team to remove his name from the door. I know this because his assistant, Marguerite, who had worked with him for 19 years and wore the same style of pearl-button earrings every single day of her professional life, called me personally to tell me. And her voice had that particular quality of someone who is crying through their nose, so their voice doesn't betray them. They didn't even let him take the fern, she said. That fern. He'd brought it in as a seedling in 2003. It was the size of a small table by the time they walked him out. I used to tease him about it. He would water it before his first meeting, every morning, without fail, the way other men check their phones. I am telling you about a plant, because that is the level of attention I'm asking you to bring to what follows. Details matter. Small things carried forward matter. The people who underestimate quiet women always make the same mistake. They see us noticing the fern and they think we are sentimental. We are not sentimental. We are gathering data. Walter never fully recovered from the dismissal. That is not a dramatic thing to say. It is a clinical and accurate one. He had built his sense of purpose around that institution, the way some men build it around a church, and when Viridian removed it from him, not because his performance had faltered, not because the division was struggling, but because a 34-year-old CFO with a mandate to cut legacy costs had looked at a spreadsheet and seen a salary rather than a person. Something shifted in him that we could not shift back. He kept his dignity. He always kept his dignity. but I would find him sometimes at the white oak table just sitting, hands flat on the surface, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting with the particular stillness of a man who has lost his coordinates. He was supposed to have 10 more years. That's what the cardiologist said at his last annual. Strong heart, good numbers, keep up the walking. He had 17 months. I am not saying Viridian killed my husband. I am saying that I watched what losing that job did to him. And I'm a woman who has always believed that watching something carefully is a form of responsibility. And that responsibility, once it takes root, does not let go easily. The funeral was on a Saturday. 240 people came, which is exactly the number of people who worked in the division Walter built. Reed gave a eulogy that was beautifully written and focused, as Reed's remarks tend to focus on the aspects of his father that made Reed look like a good son. Claire cried the kind of tears that photograph well. I sat in the front pew, in a charcoal dress that Walter had once told me made me look like I was running the meeting, and I held my granddaughter Lily's hand. She was 7. She had her grandfather's eyes. She kept looking at the casket the way children look at things they are trying to understand and cannot. And I did not fall apart, and I did not perform falling apart, and I filed everything I was feeling into a place I could return to when I had the right instrument to do something about it. The reception afterward was at my house, the one Walter and I bought in 1987 for $212,000 and paid off in 2009, the one with the maple tree out front that has grown so large it now shades half the street, the one I have maintained, repaired, refinished, and renegotiated the insurance on for 36 years. The food was catered by a woman named Darla, who had known Walter since they were neighbors in their 20s, and who brought his favorite lemon pound cake without being asked, and who pressed my hand when she left and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Reed stayed late. He stood in my kitchen with his tie loosened and a glass of Walter's good bourbon. I noticed he poured from the bottle without asking, which was not the first time, and he told me that he and Claire had been talking, and that they were concerned about the house. The house, I said. It's a lot to manage alone, Mom. It's a big property. I managed this property while your father was traveling 40 weeks a year. He smiled the way people smile when they've decided to be patient with you. That was different. I want to note for the record that I did not throw the bourbon at him. I considered it. The glass had good heft. But I am 73 years old. I have been married for 45 years to a man of considerable substance. I have run operations teams across 4 time zones, and I know the difference between a moment that calls for action and a moment that calls for accumulation. The moment that calls for action comes later. It always comes later. The discipline is in knowing the difference. That night was a moment for accumulation. I said goodnight to my son. I locked the front door. That deadbolt has a particular solid click that Walter installed himself in 1993, and I have never once taken for granted. And I went to the white oak table, and I sat in the dark with a cold cup of tea, and I thought about Viridian Consolidated Group. Not with hatred. I want to be clear about that, because the women who have lived a version of this story know that hatred is not what drives the long work. Hatred burns fast and hot, and wastes fuel you need for other things. What I felt sitting at that table in the dark was something older and quieter than hatred. It was the feeling of a door that should be closed and is not, a draft from a room where the accounting has not been settled. That feeling does not go away on its own. You either close the door yourself, or you live with the draft forever. I had spent my entire professional life closing drafts. I should explain what I knew about Viridian and what I knew about money, because both are relevant, and people will assume one of those things, and not the other. Walter handled the investments. That is the assumption, and it is correct, as far as it goes. But what people tend to assume from that is that I, therefore, didn't understand them. I was the operations manager for a regional logistics firm for 22 years. I managed budgets that ran to 9 figures. I sat across from bank auditors and bond underwriters and procurement attorneys before Reed knew what a bond was. When I say Walter handled the investments, I mean Walter enjoyed handling the investments. He liked the research. He liked the spreadsheets. He liked spending a Sunday afternoon with a pot of coffee and 4 annual reports and a yellow legal pad. I let him enjoy it. There is a difference between not doing a thing and not knowing how. After the funeral, I sat down and went through everything. Every account, every position, every statement going back to 1997. It took me 11 days. I used a yellow legal pad and a blue pen and a cup of coffee that I finished before it went cold, and I built a complete picture of our financial life the way I used to build logistics flow maps, methodically, without rushing, without skipping steps, and without needing anyone to explain the legend to me. What I found was that we were comfortable, more than comfortable. Walter had been careful and patient and smart, and we had no debt, a diversified portfolio, and enough liquid assets that I did not need to worry about the ordinary expenses of a long and reasonably expensive life. What I also found on the 11th day, on page 43 of a prospectus that Walter had paperclipped to an old Viridian annual report, was a notation in his handwriting. Small, careful, in the neat block print he had always used, because his cursive, as he cheerfully admitted, looked like a man describing an earthquake while having one. The notation read, VCG diluted, watch Q3, buyback window, VCG, Viridian Consolidated Group. I sat with that notation for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the maple tree in the front yard was bare. It was February, and the street had the particular stillness of a neighborhood on a weekday afternoon. I could smell the coffee I'd made an hour earlier and not drunk. I could hear the clock above the stove. I sat with that piece of paper, and I thought about a man who had spent 31 years building something, been thrown out with a cardboard box, spent 17 months finding his way back to himself, and had died before he got there, but who had, even in those 17 months, in the middle of his own grief, noticed something worth noticing, and written it down. Walter had not been watching Viridian as revenge. That was not who he was. He'd been watching it the way he watched everything that touched his professional world, out of habit, out of the same precision that had made him exceptional at his work for 3 decades. He'd noticed something about their share structure. He'd made a note. Then he'd gotten sick, and the note had stayed on page 43 of a prospectus in a file cabinet in the study, and he had died before he'd done anything with it. I pulled the annual reports, the 10Ks, the proxy statements. I am not a securities attorney, and I am not a financial analyst, but I am a woman who has read more contracts than most people have read novels, and what I found over the following 6 weeks, sitting at the white oak table with a fresh legal pad and a pot of coffee, and the particular patience of someone who has nothing but time and a very specific direction, was this: Viridian Consolidated Group, in the process of restructuring their executive compensation package and executing a buyback program to prop up a share price that had been quietly declining for 2 years, had thinned their public float to a point where a sufficiently determined and patient outside investor could, over time, acquire a meaningful position without triggering a disclosure threshold that would alert the company. Not a majority, not a takeover, something quieter, a board seat, influence, a voice in a room they would rather not have me in, a presence they could not ignore and could not easily dislodge. I called a securities attorney named Patricia Osei, who had been recommended by a woman in my Thursday book club, whose daughter had used her for a small business acquisition. Patricia had short, natural hair, an office full of plants that she clearly knew how to keep alive, and the kind of directness I have always found restoring in a professional context. She didn't perform authority. She simply had it. She walked me through the regulatory landscape without condescending to me and without oversimplifying. She told me what was possible and what was not, what would draw attention and what would not, and at what threshold I would need to disclose my position publicly. She also told me that what I was describing, a sustained, methodical, open market accumulation over a period of 18 to 24 months, was entirely legal, entirely common among activist investors, and not the kind of thing that made headlines, unless you made it make headlines. "What do you want to do with the position if you get it?" she asked. "I want a board seat," I said. "Or I want them to offer to buy me out at a number that reflects exactly how much inconvenience I am prepared to cause them." She wrote something down. She did not look surprised. "And if neither happens?" Then I attend every shareholder meeting for the rest of my natural life, and I ask very specific questions about executive compensation and workforce management practices at every single one, into the microphone, in front of everyone who owns a share of that company. Patricia smiled. It was small and didn't need an audience. "Let's get started," she said. That was 26 months before Reed walked through my front door with a canvas tote bag. The buying took patience. That is the honest word for it. I set up a separate brokerage account, funded it from my portion of our joint assets, and began purchasing shares in Viridian Consolidated Group the way you plant a garden, in intervals, in different quantities, in a pattern that does not announce itself or draw a straight line for anyone watching. Patricia reviewed the compliance requirements at each stage, and we stayed well clear of every threshold. I kept records in a 3-ring binder, a green one, the utilitarian kind they sell by the dozen at office supply stores, that I stored in the filing cabinet in the study, behind Walter's old divisional reports, in a drawer that neither of my children had ever opened, because neither of my children had ever been sufficiently curious about my filing system to look. That drawer was 4 feet from the chair where Reed had sat at my dining room table telling me I needed a second pair of eyes. I want to stop here and acknowledge something, because I think it matters, and I think you are exactly the right audience for it. I am not a perfect person, and this was not a perfect plan. There was a period of roughly 3 months, about 8 months into the accumulation, when the Viridian share price dropped unexpectedly after a competitor acquisition that I hadn't modeled, where I seriously considered stopping the whole thing. Not because I was frightened or confused or running out of resources, because I looked at the numbers and I thought about what Walter would have said, and what Walter would have said. Because I knew him. I knew the honest version of him, the one that existed before dinners with the kids and the polished versions of things. Was that buying stock in a company because you're angry is a poor reason to buy stock in a company? He would have been right, and he would have been wrong, because the anger was not the reason I was doing this. The anger was the ignition. The reason was something more precise than anger and harder to name, a sense that what had been done to him should have a consequence, a real one that lived in the same world of quarterly earnings and board composition and proxy votes, where the decision to discard him had been made. They had treated him like a line item on a restructuring spreadsheet. I was going to become one of theirs, a line on a materiality analysis, a name at a shareholder meeting, a position they needed to account for. And I was going to do it in a way that was lawful and proportionate and impossible to dismiss as merely personal. I kept going. And I want to be honest about one more thing. During those 26 months, I did not tell my children what I was doing, not because I was hiding it from them as some kind of game, because I had watched the way both of them had begun to talk to me since the funeral, the volume at which they explained things, the particular patience they deployed when I mentioned anything financial or future-related, the small rearrangements of their faces when I spoke about plans that extended past the next season. I had watched my son explain how a Roth conversion worked to a woman who had spent 2 decades managing 9-figure capital allocations. I had watched my daughter gently redirect a conversation about my estate planning into a conversation about whether I was sleeping enough. They were doing what children do when they are frightened and love you and don't have a better tool. I understand that. I hold that clearly. But I had concluded, with some sadness and more calm than the sadness deserved, that if I told them what I was building, they would not take it seriously. They would worry. They would consult people. They would convene. And then they would try, with the best of intentions and absolutely no comprehension of what they were looking at, to manage it. They would call it helping. So I said nothing. I kept the green binder in the drawer. I made my purchases. I had my quarterly calls with Patricia. I kept attending my book club and my Tuesday morning walks with my neighbor Frances, and the occasional dinner with my children, where I ate their food and listened to their lives and answered their questions about my well-being with the accurate but incomplete answer that I was keeping myself very busy. I was. Let me tell you about the 18 months before the envelope, because this is where the disrespect stopped being a feeling and became something with a form. Reed lives 40 minutes away in a house that costs 3 times what mine did, and that his wife Sandra decorated in a style I believe is called transitional contemporary. which means it is expensive, has no edges, and is arranged in a way that does not suggest any particular person actually lives there. He is a senior vice president at a mid-size investment firm. He manages other people's risk for a living. And he's genuinely good at it, which is a real thing. I mean, as a real compliment. He has Walter's jawline and my stubbornness, and he has built a professional life on his ability to see patterns in data and respond to them quickly. The problem, in the context of our relationship after Walter died, was that he began to apply this skill to me. I became a set of variables, a risk profile, a person whose behaviors could be charted and whose deviations from expected behavior could be flagged. 7 months after the funeral, Reed told me over dinner that he'd talked to a financial advisor about my situation. He had not asked whether I wanted a financial advisor consulted on my situation. He had simply done it. Told this man, Derek Folsom, certain things about my accounts and my assets. Not all things because Reed did not know all things, but enough to constitute a summary, and presented the idea as a helpful gesture that I would surely appreciate. "He can just take a look," Reed said. "Give you a second pair of eyes." I said thank you and finished my dinner. I set my fork down in the particular way that means I am done with both the food and the topic, and I looked at my son across his wife's very clean table, and I thought, you are telling me that your fear about me is more important than your confidence in me, and you do not know that that is what you are saying. I went home and I looked at my primary account, the one Reed had limited visibility into through the emergency contact designation I'd added years ago, and I looked at what he would be seeing when he looked at it. He would see periodic transfers out, meaningful ones, quarterly in varying amounts, all going to an account number he didn't recognize and couldn't trace without asking. He would see money leaving. He would not know where it was going. I had a choice at that point. I could tell him, or I could let him watch and see what he did with what he was watching. I let him watch. This was the flawed thing I did. I want to name it clearly because I said I would be honest, and because the story is less useful to you if I present myself as entirely without fault. I could have told Reed what the money was for at any point in those 26 months, and I chose not to, and while my reasons were sound and my conclusions about his likely response were accurate, the choice still cost something. It cost him months of mounting worry. It cost Claire her own sleepless nights. They brought a stranger into my house with printed bank statements because I had let the information gap grow until it became a canyon, and some portion of that is on me. I hold that. I don't think it changes what needed to happen, but I hold it. What Reed did with what he was watching, in the 8 months between that dinner and the Tuesday he walked through my door, was this. He saved the account summaries he could see. He researched elder financial fraud. He compiled a folder of articles about widows being targeted by scammers, about cognitive decline masquerading as normal grief behavior, about the specific vulnerability of recently bereaved women of a certain age. He called Claire and shared his concerns in a series of phone calls that Claire described to me, much later, as escalating. He consulted Derek Folsom without telling me. He called a family therapist once, I found out eventually, to ask whether an intervention about finances was appropriate. The therapist apparently said to approach it with curiosity, not accusation. You can see how well that went. Claire, for her part, did not do all of this. Claire is more instinctive than Reed and less given to systems. But Claire had her own version of the same worry, and it expressed itself in the thing I described earlier. The checking, the dropping by, the medicine cabinet. And about 4 months before the Tuesday, it expressed itself in something more pointed. She asked me about the transfers directly. We were at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning. She had brought pastries from the French bakery on Delmar. She knows I like the almond croissant. She has known this for years. She brought 3 of them, which meant she had planned this conversation and brought the croissants as a kind of cushion. I noticed the cushion. I ate the croissant. "Mom," she said, "I was talking to Reed, and we noticed, he noticed, I looked. There have been some transfers from your main account that seem pretty large. We're not trying to be in your business." "But," I said, "but we love you. And Dad was the one who always, you're great with money, I know you are. I just want to make sure someone hasn't gotten access to your accounts who shouldn't have." That was the sentence. That was the one. Not cruel, not dismissive, not stupid. She said it with genuine tenderness, looking at me over the rim of her coffee cup with her father's forehead wide and worried, and I felt the particular thing that is harder to name than anger, the feeling of being looked at by someone who loves you as if they are no longer quite sure you are real. I am great with money. I know you are, said with the emphasis of someone conceding a point they are not entirely certain of. I set my almond croissant down on the plate. I looked at my daughter, and I said, I appreciate that. I want you to know I'm fine and the accounts are fine and I have a plan for the transfers. All right? Can you tell me about the plan? Not yet. She looked at me for a moment that was just slightly too long. Okay, she said, and she let it go, and she was gracious about letting it go, and she ate her own croissant, and we talked about other things, but something had shifted in the room, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so. That was the last Saturday morning before the Tuesday. The Tuesday. Let me bring you back to it now, because I've circled around it long enough, and I want you to feel the actual texture of it. The way the light came in, the weight of what everybody brought, the particular quality of a room where people think they know the story. I had been expecting something. I hadn't known it would be that Tuesday specifically. I'd come downstairs that morning at 6:15 the way I always do, made a full pot of coffee. Not the abbreviated pot I made when Walter was traveling, but a full one, the way I've made it since he died, as a kind of insistence on a certain size of life. And I'd sat at the white oak table with the brokerage statement that had arrived the previous Thursday, in which I had been deliberately not opening until I was ready. I was ready. I opened it. I read the summary page. I read the detail page. I folded it once and I held it. 4.7% of Viridian Consolidated Group. As of the close of business on the prior Thursday, acquired over 26 months in the open market through 48 separate purchases ranging from $3,000 to $47,000. All documented, all compliant, all sitting in the green 3-ring binder in the filing cabinet in the study. I had crossed the threshold. At 5% I could file a shareholder proposal. At 4.7, in a float, as thin as Viridian's current one, I was close enough that a sufficiently observant institutional holder would have started to notice the accumulation. Patricia had flagged this in our last call. She said we should be prepared for the company to reach out. She also said we should be prepared for them not to, which would tell us something about the quality of their governance monitoring and would be useful ammunition later. I sat at the white oak table holding the statement, and I thought about what was coming, not the intervention. I didn't know about the intervention yet, specifically, though I had known something was coming for months, the way you know weather from the pressure in your knees before it arrives. What I was thinking about was Viridian's annual meeting, which was scheduled for April, 3 months away, and the shareholder proposal I had already drafted with Patricia, which called for new governance guidelines around workforce restructuring decisions, specifically requiring human capital impact assessments and board-level approval for reduction in force actions above a certain threshold. The threshold we had chosen was not accidental. It corresponded exactly to the size of Walter's division. I was not asking them to apologize. I was asking them to build a structure that would make the next Walter Mallory harder to discard. That was the thing that felt proportionate. That was the thing that felt worth 2 years of early mornings. I heard the car in the driveway at 9:43. I knew it was Reed's car because he has owned a silver sedan for 15 years, replacing the model but not the color, and because it pulled into my driveway with the particular certainty of someone who has arrived with a plan. I heard a second car a few minutes later, Claire's, smaller, parked on the street. I heard a third door, the advisor's presumably, and I thought about going to the kitchen to make more coffee but decided against it. The coffee I had made was still in the pot. Let them have what was already there. I sat at the white oak table with the statement in my hand. I waited. The door. Reed had a key from years ago, the emergency key I'd given him when Walter had his first small cardiac event in 2019, and we'd decided someone should be able to get in quickly if needed. He had never used it for an emergency. He had used it, in the time since Walter died, 3 or 4 times when he arrived and I was in the back garden and couldn't hear the bell. I had noted each time and had not mentioned it. Another accumulation. He opened the door and came in with the tote, and I have already told you what that looked like. But what I haven't told you is the smell of the room when they all came in. Reed's aftershave, something cedar and serious, and Claire's hand cream, the lavender kind she's used for years, and the cool draft of outside air that came in with them. February still in it, and underneath all of that, the smell of my own kitchen, coffee and old wood, and the faintest remnant of the lemon pound cake I'd made the previous Sunday, because I make it sometimes, and Darla's recipe is the only right one. They sat across from me on the blue sofa, all three of them, though Derek Folsom angled himself slightly apart in the armchair, the way people do when they've been brought to a family situation and want to signal they are a professional resource, not a family member. He had an expensive pen and had already opened his portfolio to a blank page. Reed put the printouts on the table. He did it the way he does things at work, arranged, purposeful, with a particular quiet that is less peace and more preparation. He set them down in front of me, and then he set a folder beside them. The folder had a pharmacy logo on the outside, which struck me as the wrong container for what I suspected was inside, and then I realized he'd grabbed whatever folder was available, and that the pharmacy logo was accidental, which was the most human detail in the room. "Mom," he said, "we're worried about the withdrawals." And I said what I told you I said. The conversation that followed had a rhythm I recognized from 30 years of difficult professional meetings, the kind where the people on one side of the table have decided what the outcome is before the meeting starts, and the agenda is designed to create the impression of process while actually foreclosing it. Reed had his points, his documentation, his expert. He moved through them with the efficiency of a man who has prepared. Claire followed his lead, which was unusual for her, and I could see that she'd made a decision to defer to him on the structure of this, to let him carry the professional frame while she carried the emotional one, and that this had been agreed upon in advance. What they had not agreed upon in advance was that the frame would not hold. "Mrs. Mallory," Derek said after we'd been at it for about 10 minutes, "I want to be clear that I'm not here in any official capacity. Reed asked me to come informally, just to assess whether I'm being scammed," I said. A pause. "To offer a second perspective. Have you been told what my professional background is?" He looked at Reed briefly. "Reed mentioned you were in logistics. Operations management. Final authority on capital allocations up to $40 million. Brokerage account since 1985. I managed the household finances for 45 years, alongside a husband who also managed them, which means I've had two people looking at every financial decision in this house for 4 decades. I set the brokerage statement on the table. "Do you know what this is?" He leaned forward to look. He was professional about it. He didn't reach for it, just read what he could see from across the table. I watched his face change as he parsed what he was looking at. "That's a position statement," he said. "It is. That's—" He stopped. "A significant position." "Yes." Reed reached across then. That is the motion I remember, his hand extended, taking the statement, turning it so he could read it, and the quality of his silence as he did. Reed has a particular silence for when numbers are speaking. This was that silence, and it went on for a long moment. He handed it to Claire without speaking. Claire read it, read it again, looked at me. "Mom," she said, "this is Viridian." "Yes, this is." She stopped, looked at the number. "Mom, 4.7% and I and Sin," I said, "as of 9:30 this morning." The room had changed. I want to try to describe this accurately because it matters, the way a room can shift without anything visible moving. The same furniture, the same light from the window, the same coffee going cold on the counter, but the air is a different composition. Something had been assumed in that room for the previous 20 minutes, and now it was not assumed anymore. Derek Folsom had stopped writing. Reed was looking at the statement, and I could see him doing what he does, building the model, running the numbers, calculating the approximate value of the position, understanding the implication of the threshold. His face was not the face he'd come in with. That face had been arranged into a patient, prepared concern. This face was purely cognitive. The concern was still there, but it had shifted register. He was not looking at his mother, who might be confused. He was looking at a position statement that made no sense given the story he'd told himself for 26 months, and he was trying to reconcile those two things. "You've been buying Viridian," he said. It was not a question. "For 26 months. Why? I let the question sit. Outside, the maple moved in something that wasn't quite wind. A breath of air, barely enough to disturb the branches, just enough to register. The clock above the stove made its small sound. The coffee on the counter was cold. They dismissed your father after 31 years, I said, without cause, without ceremony, without the basic dignity of letting him take his fern. They treated 31 years as a liability, and a man of his quality as a cost they were tired of carrying. I decided there should be a consequence for that. A real one that lives in the same world of quarterly earnings and board composition and proxy votes, where the decision to discard him was made. Reed was very still. I have a shareholder proposal drafted, I said. Patricia Osei. She's a securities attorney here in the city. I can give you her contact. Patricia has reviewed it, and we're prepared to file it ahead of their April annual meeting. The proposal calls for new governance guidelines requiring human capital impact assessments and board-level review of workforce restructuring decisions above a specific threshold. I paused. The threshold corresponds to the size of your father's division. Claire made a sound that was not quite a word. I have also been in preliminary contact with 2 other long-term institutional holders who have expressed interest in governance reform at Viridian. I am not the only person watching this company. I am simply the one with the most specific reason to watch it. Reed put both hands flat on the table. That gesture, his father's gesture, exactly, down to the precise pressure of the palms, the way the fingers spread slightly, as if he is making contact with a surface to orient himself. You did this alone, he said. I did. For 2 years. 26 months. He looked at the pharmacy folder. He looked at his highlighted printouts. He looked at Derek Folsom, who had the particular stillness of a man who has walked into a situation he was not briefed on correctly and is recalibrating everything in real time. Then Reed looked at me, and there was something in his face that I recognized and that moved me even in that moment. It was not embarrassment exactly, and it was not admiration exactly. It was the look of someone who has been holding a story about a person and has just understood that the story was incomplete, that the person continued to exist in ways the story did not account for. I know that look. I wore it myself occasionally in my career. It is one of the more instructive faces a person can show you. Mom, Reed said, and his voice had changed. The professional frame gone, just my son now. Why didn't you tell us? This was the question I had been waiting for. Because I needed you to watch, I said. I know that sounds hard, and I'm sorry for the worry it caused. I genuinely am. But I needed to know, I needed to understand what you would do when you thought you were looking at something that concerned you. And what you did was call a meeting without asking me to come. What you did was hire an expert without telling me. What you did was walk into my house and put printouts on my table and call it a conversation. I kept my voice level. I needed to see that. Claire had set down the brokerage statement. Her hands were in her lap now, and she had the expression, her father's expression, the one that means she is inside something large and taking inventory. We weren't trying to— I know, I said. I know exactly what you were trying to do. That's what I'm telling you. The room was quiet for a long moment, not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet in which people are actually thinking. Derek Folsom closed his portfolio with a soft, precise sound. He placed the expensive pen on top of it. He looked at me with the straightforwardness of someone who has decided to abandon the script entirely. Mrs. Mallory, he said, I owe you an apology. I was given a description of this situation that was incomplete, and I should have asked more questions before agreeing to come. I'm sorry for that. He meant it. I could tell. Thank you, Derek, I said. You were asked to help someone you trusted. That's not a failing. He nodded. He gathered his things with the quiet efficiency of a professional who understands his role has ended. He stood and shook my hand. He did not offer the limp palm handshake of someone unsure of the power dynamics in the room. He shook my hand the way you shake the hand of someone you have just understood, you have underestimated, which is to say firmly and with eye contact. Then he left. The front door closed behind him with that solid click. The 3 of us sat in the room that remained. Reed picked up the brokerage statement again. He read it the way he reads things he needs to understand completely. From the top, systematically, not skipping. He set it down and he said, Patricia Osei. You said she's local. Corner of Delmar and Forsyth, 11th floor. I'd like to meet her. He paused. If you'd be okay with that. I'll send you her contact today. Another pause. Reed has always taken longer at the threshold moments, the ones where you cross from one version of a thing to another. He always has. Even as a child, he would stand at the edge of the swimming pool long after other children had jumped, not from fear exactly, but from a need to account for all variables before committing. I used to find this exasperating. I find it now, mostly his father's son. What do you need from us, he said, going forward, with this? I looked at him for a moment. I looked at Claire, who was still and attentive in the particular way. That means she is listening with more than her ears. I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing, Aoi, I said. I need you to ask before you consult on my behalf, and when I'm ready to tell you something, I need you to hear it as information, not as a problem to manage. Reed nodded slowly. Okay, he said. That's the whole ask, I said. Claire got up and went to the kitchen. I heard her running water, heard the clink of a mug against the counter, heard the particular sound of the coffee maker doing the second heat. She knows I keep the pot warm, and she came back with 2 mugs and the pot, and she poured without being asked. She filled my cup first and then Reed's, and then settled back into the sofa and tucked her feet up the way she has since she was a teenager. And she said, "Tell me about the proposal, the one you drafted." So I told them. I told them about the governance guidelines. I told them about the human capital threshold. I told them about the 2 institutional holders and the preliminary conversations Patricia had facilitated. I told them about the April annual meeting and the proxy materials and the specific questions I had prepared and rehearsed and did not need notes for. I told them about Marguerite's phone call and the fern and the notation on page 43, and I watched Reed's face when I described his father's handwriting. VCG, diluted, watch Q3, buyback window. And I watched him do the thing he had been trying not to do for the previous 20 minutes, which is grieve his father in front of me, which he did quietly and without announcement, looking down at the table, and I let him do it, because it was the right thing to happen in that room, and it had been a long time coming. Claire said, "He would have loved this." I looked at her. "Yes," I said, "he would have." We sat at the white oak table with the bow in the middle, and the coffee that for once I remembered to drink before it went cold, and we talked for another 2 hours, and the afternoon went long, in particular, and full of the kind of conversation that only happens when people have stopped performing their roles at each other and are just being themselves in a room together. Reed stayed until 4. He carried his tote bag out the same door he'd carried it in, but differently. The weight of it had changed. Not the physical weight. It still had the same printouts in it, the same highlighted statements, but a thing had been removed from it that had made it heavy in a way the paper never had. Claire hugged me at the door in the way she used to when she was small, both arms, serious about it. She smelled like lavender hand cream and cold air and lemon from the pound cake I'd sliced for them before they left. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." "I know," I said. "Me too." That was enough. It was genuinely enough. I locked the front door. That click. That good, solid click. And I went back to the white oak table and I sat with the brokerage statement and the room that had just been occupied and was now mine again. The maple outside had gone still. The afternoon light was doing the thing it does in February, where it comes in low and turns everything slightly gold and slightly sad at the same time. I held the statement and I thought about what came next. The filing, the meeting, the questions into the microphone, the particular satisfaction of a long plan arriving at its moment. I thought about Walter at this table, hands flat, not reading, just sitting. And I thought about the notation on page 43, and I thought about what it means to finish something that someone you loved had the instinct to start, but not the time to follow through on. It means something. I don't have a cleaner word for it than that. There is a thing that happened 3 weeks after the Tuesday that I want to tell you about, because it speaks to the kind of precision that 2 years of patience can build when the building is done carefully. Patricia and I met with Viridian's lead independent director, a man named Gordon Ash, who had a silver ponytail and the careful manner of someone who knows he is in a meeting that has been engineered, that he did not call it and does not entirely control it. He brought their general counsel and a communications person who sat against the wall and typed into a laptop throughout. We sat across from them at a conference table on the 31st floor of a building downtown that had views of the river and carpet that had been selected to convey permanence. Gordon Ash looked at my position summary. He looked at the shareholder proposal. He looked at Patricia, who said nothing, because Patricia knows exactly when silence is the right instrument. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Mallory, Hadouat," he said. "What is it you actually want here?" I had thought about this question for 26 months. I had a precise answer. 3 things, I said. First, the governance guidelines in the proposal, adopted formally before the annual meeting rather than presented as a shareholder contest. Second, a board seat, or a board observer role with defined rights, for a candidate of my choosing who has expertise in workforce policy. I paused. And third, a formal written acknowledgement from this company's current board of the manner in which Walter Mallory's employment was terminated. Not an apology, necessarily. An acknowledgement. A statement, on the record, that a 31-year employee deserved a more deliberate and humane process than he received. Gordon Ash said nothing for a moment. He had the expression of someone turning an object over in his hands to find the best angle. "The third item," he said. "That's not standard." "No," I said, "it isn't. What would you do with it?" "I would keep it, Wayne," I said. "I would not publish it. I would not use it in any litigation. I have no interest in litigation. I would keep it in the filing cabinet where I keep the rest of my records, and I would know it exists, and that would be sufficient." He was quiet for a long moment. The communications person had stopped typing. "I'll need to bring this to the full board," he said. "Of course," I said. "You have Patricia's contact. I expect to hear within 2 weeks." I stood. Patricia stood. I shook Gordon Ash's hand across the 31st floor conference table with the river visible behind him, and I held his gaze for a moment. And I thought about a cardboard box and a parking garage and a fern the size of a small table that no one had bothered to save. "Thank you for the meeting," I said. 14 days later, Patricia called. 12 days after that, the documents arrived. All 3 items agreed to. The governance guidelines were announced to shareholders the following week as a board-initiated governance enhancement. Their phrasing, which made me smile, the kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. The board observer role went to a woman named Dr. Celestine Wade, who had spent 30 years researching workforce policy, and who Patricia had introduced me to 4 months earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment. The written acknowledgement came in a sealed letter on company stationery, signed by all 7 board members. I read it once. I placed it in the green 3-ring binder. I closed the filing cabinet. I made a pot of coffee, a full one, and I sat at the white oak table and I let it go cold. "I want to talk to you now. Not Augusta Mallory, operations manager, widow, shareholder. Just me, talking to you. Because I think you came to this story with something specific in your chest, and I want to address it directly. You did not come here for the share certificates. You came here because you recognized something in the setup, the lowered voices, the printouts on the table, the financial advisor who wasn't asked for, the patient concern that was not quite concern, and not quite something else, but lived in between, heavy and presuming. You came here because you have sat at a table while people who love you decided, with the best of intentions, that your grief or your age or your quiet meant that you needed to be supervised, that the things you had learned and built and understood across a lifetime of paying attention had somehow become less legible to the people around you, not because you had changed, because they had decided you had. I want to say something about Reed and Claire before I leave you with the thing I actually want to leave you with. Reed called me on the Thursday after the Tuesday. He called from his office. I could tell there was the particular background quality of a room with other rooms adjacent to it. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said, about asking before consulting on someone else's behalf, and that he understood it and wanted me to know that he understood it, and that he was sorry for the way the morning had been conducted. He said this in the careful, precise way he says things he means, but is not entirely comfortable feeling, which is how I knew it was genuine. Claire sent flowers, not the sympathy kind, the kind she sends when she's celebrating something bright, extravagant, full of oranges and yellows, The kind of arrangement that takes up the whole counter and smells like a room insisting on itself. The card said, "Dad would have taken notes." I put the flowers in the blue pitcher on the kitchen counter, the one Walter found at a flea market in 2011, and bought for $3 because he said the blue was exactly right, and I looked at them for a long time and felt something that I do not have a name for and am not sure needs one. I have been to 2 Viridian Board Observer meetings now. Dr. Wade brings a binder of her own, red, not green, but the same utilitarian kind from the same office supply store. And she has a way of asking questions that is so precise and so patient that the other board members answer more thoroughly than they intend to. I sit in the back of those meetings. I do not speak. I do not need to. I am there. I am on the record. That is enough. Now here is what I want to leave you with. Go find your paper. Not metaphorically. Literally. This week. Whatever paper represents the thing you have built or inherited or earned or decided. The deed, the account, the policy, the business registration, the trust document, the contract, the membership agreement, the will, the letter in the filing cabinet that you have meant to update for 3 years. Find it and read it. Not because you don't know what's in it, because knowing precisely what's in it is the difference between sitting at a table where decisions are being made about you and sitting at a table where you are the one who holds the document. The people who watched the money leave my accounts for 26 months never once asked where it was going. They watched. They worried. They compiled their folder of articles and their highlighted statements, and they hired their advisor, and they rehearsed their gentle, careful conversation. Not one of them, not my son who prices risk for a living, not my daughter who was checking on me every 3 days, not the man with the soft leather portfolio, looked up from the outflows long enough to ask about the destination. That is the lesson. Not a lesson about stocks or corporate governance, or the mechanics of a shareholder proposal. A lesson about the assumption, the one that goes unexamined, the one nobody thinks to question, that the quiet woman sitting at the table is waiting for someone to tell her what she already knows, know whose name is on the paper. Because the people who assume it's someone else's tend to find out in rooms they didn't expect, at moments they didn't plan for, holding printouts they brought to prove something that turns out to be exactly wrong. And the woman across the table will not raise her voice. She will not need to. She stopped needing the last word years ago. She has something better. She has the document.